What happens when a royal guest completely loses control on live television, sparking one of the most explosive confrontations daytime TV has ever witnessed? Today, we're diving into the shocking moment Prince Harry was forcibly removed from Whoopi Goldberg's show after a heated exchange that left studio audiences gasping and producers scrambling. This isn't just another celebrity feud. This is a masterclass in how privilege and entitlement can spectacularly backfire when met with uncompromising journalism. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below with your thoughts on what you think really triggered Harry's meltdown. The studio lights were blazing as Whoopi Goldberg settled into her familiar chair, her trademark confidence radiating through the television screens of millions of viewers. Across from her sat Prince Harry, fidgeting with his cufflinks in a way that suggested this wasn't going to be the softball interview his handlers had promised. The tension was already palpable before the cameras even started rolling, with production assistants whispering nervously in the wings about the prince's increasingly agitated demeanor during the pre-show briefings. "So, Harry," Whoopi began, her voice carrying that distinctive blend of warmth and steel that had made her a broadcasting legend. "Let's talk about accountability. You've spent years pointing fingers at the media, at your family, at institutions. But when do we get to the part where you take responsibility for your own actions?" Harry's jaw tightened visibly, his practiced media smile faltering for just a moment before he attempted to regain his composure. "Well, Whoopi, I think that's quite an unfair characterization of what I've been trying to do. I've been incredibly transparent about my journey and the mistakes I've made along the way." Transparent. Whoopi's eyebrow arched in that way that veteran talk show hosts perfect over decades of dealing with evasive guests. Is that what we're calling it when you cherry-pick which stories to tell, while conveniently leaving out the parts that might make you look bad? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like selective storytelling than transparency. The prince shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands now gripping the armrests with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but everything I've shared has been truthful and from the heart. Perhaps the real question is why certain media personalities seem so invested in tearing down someone who's simply trying to live authentically." Whoopi leaned forward slightly, her expression never wavering from that perfect balance of professional courtesy and journalistic persistence. "Oh, honey, we're not tearing anybody down here. We're just asking the questions that your previous interviewers seem to have forgotten to ask. Like why you felt it was appropriate to air your family's private business on a global stage while simultaneously demanding privacy for yourself." "That's completely different," Harry snapped, his voice rising just enough to make the sound technicians glance nervously at their levels. "When you're born into a system that refuses to protect you or acknowledge the harm it's causing, sometimes speaking out is the only option you have left. But speaking out and speaking responsibly are two different things, aren't they?" Whoopi countered smoothly. "When you make allegations without providing context or evidence, when you paint yourself as the sole victim in complex family dynamics, doesn't that strike you as a little convenient? A little self-serving?" Harry's face was beginning to flush. Now, that telltale reddening that royal watchers had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "I think what's convenient is how easy it is for people who've never lived under that kind of scrutiny to sit in judgment. You have no idea what it's like to have every aspect of your life dissected and criticized." "Actually, sweetheart," Whoopi said, her tone remaining maddeningly calm, "I know exactly what it's like to be scrutinized and criticized. The difference is, when I mess up, I own it. I don't write a book about how everyone else is to blame for my problems." The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something far more intense than the typical celebrity chat show segment. Production assistants were making frantic gestures from behind the cameras, but Whoopi seemed determined to press forward with her line of questioning. "Let's talk specifics," she continued, pulling out a small stack of note cards. "You've made some pretty serious accusations about your family members. Some might even call them character assassinations. But when pressed for details or evidence, you seem to get a little vague. How do you reconcile demanding accountability from others while avoiding it yourself?" Harry's composure was rapidly deteriorating, his voice taking on a sharp edge that his media training had supposedly eliminated. "I don't have to reconcile anything. I've lived through experiences that would break most people, and I've had the courage to speak about them publicly. If that makes some people uncomfortable, well, maybe they should examine why the truth is so threatening to them. But whose truth are we talking about here? Whoopi pressed, her journalist instincts now fully engaged. Because truth isn't just about your perspective or your feelings. Truth involves facts, context, other people's experiences. And from what I can see, you seem pretty selective about which facts make it into your version of events. The prince was now visibly agitated, his carefully maintained royal composure cracking under the sustained pressure of questions that actually challenged his narrative. This is exactly the kind of hostile interrogation that drove me away from that life. In the first place, I came here expecting a respectful conversation, not some kind of ambush. Nobody's ambushing anybody, Whoopi replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. These are the questions any serious journalist should be asking. The fact that you're not used to hearing them says more about the softball treatment you've been getting than it does about my interview style. Harry's breathing had become noticeably shallow, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested he was fighting to maintain control. The studio lights seemed to be bearing down on him now, creating beads of perspiration that his makeup artist would normally have rushed to address. But the crew had been instructed not to interrupt the flow of this increasingly volatile interview. You know what? Harry said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he had shouted. I think I'm beginning to understand why this show struggles with credibility issues. When your idea of journalism is attacking guests who've been through genuine trauma, maybe it's time to reevaluate your approach. Whoopi's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture that suggested she was ready for whatever was coming next. Interesting that you mention credibility, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. When you make claims that can't be verified, when you contradict yourself in different interviews, when you seem to remember things differently depending on who's asking, that creates credibility issues too, doesn't it? I've never contradicted myself, Harry shot back, his voice now carrying a tremor of genuine anger. What I've done is share my truth in different contexts, with different levels of detail appropriate to each situation. The fact that you can't understand the nuance of that says more about your limitations as an interviewer than about any inconsistencies on my part. The audience was completely transfixed now, some leaning forward in their seats, as if they were watching a tennis match, their heads turning back and forth between the two combatants. Whoopi remained infuriatingly calm, her decades of experience allowing her to maintain professional composure even as her guests spiraled toward what was clearly going to be a spectacular meltdown. Let me ask you something else, Whoopi continued, consulting her notes with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew exactly which buttons to push. You've talked extensively about the importance of mental health awareness, which is admirable. But doesn't it seem a little contradictory to use your platform to publicly discuss other people's private struggles and relationships while demanding that your own privacy be respected? Harry's face was now a deep shade of red that his carefully applied television makeup couldn't entirely disguise. That's a completely unfair characterization of what I've done. I've only shared details that were necessary to provide context. From my own experiences, I never set out to hurt anyone. But impact matters more than intent, doesn't it? Whoopi pressed, her voice still maddeningly reasonable. When you tell intimate stories about your family members on global platforms, when you discuss private conversations and personal struggles, the impact on those people is the same regardless of what you intended. How do you account for that? I don't have to account for anything to you. Harry snapped, his royal training finally abandoning him completely. You're sitting there acting like some kind of moral authority, but what gives you the right to judge how I've chosen to heal from my trauma? What gives you the right to question my motivations or my methods? Whoopi leaned back slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Well, honey, I'm not judging your healing process. I'm asking about your public statements and their consequences. There's a difference between processing trauma and monetizing it, between seeking healing and seeking attention. Which category do you think your recent activities fall into? The question hung in the air like a live wire, crackling with tension that was now so thick it was almost visible. Harry's hands were trembling slightly, whether from rage or adrenaline was impossible to tell, but his carefully constructed public persona was disintegrating in real time. How dare you? He whispered, his voice barely audible, but somehow more menacing than a shout. How dare you sit there and suggest that my pain, my family's dysfunction, my mother's death, how dare you suggest that any of that is about attention or money? You have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not talking about your mother's death, Whoopi replied gently but firmly. I'm talking about how you've chosen to discuss it publicly, how you've used it as justification for behavior that might otherwise be difficult to defend. There's a difference between honoring someone's memory and weaponizing their tragedy. The studio was now so quiet that the humming of the cameras was audible, a low mechanical drone that seemed to underscore the electric tension between host and guest. Harry was breathing heavily now, his chest heaving as if he'd been running, his eyes darting around the studio as if looking for an escape route. You don't get to talk about my mother, he said, his voice rising to a level that made the sound engineers wince. You don't get to psychoanalyze my relationship with her memory or suggest that I'm somehow exploiting her death. That's crossing a line that you have no right to cross. Whoopi's expression remained steady, but there was a flicker of something. Perhaps surprise at the intensity of his reaction, perhaps recognition that she had indeed found the nerve she'd been looking for. I'm not psychoanalyzing anything. I'm simply pointing out that using personal tragedy as a shield against legitimate criticism is a pattern that might be worth examining. Legitimate criticism. Harry's voice cracked slightly on the words. Is that what you call this character? Assassination? This deliberate attempt to paint me as some kind of manipulative opportunist? I came here in good faith, expecting to have a real conversation about real issues, and instead I'm being subjected to this hostile interrogation by someone who clearly made up her mind about me before I even walked through the door. The camera operators were getting some of the most compelling television they'd ever captured, but the control room was becoming increasingly nervous about where this was heading. Harry was now standing slightly, his body language suggesting he was preparing either to flee or to fight, neither of which would be good for anyone involved. Sit down, Harry, Whoopi said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that had been earned through decades of handling difficult interviews and volatile personalities. Let's finish this conversation like adults. But Harry was beyond reason now, beyond the carefully programmed responses that had been drilled into him by teams of media consultants and crisis management experts. I don't have to sit down and I don't have to subject myself to any more of this. You want to know what the real problem is? The real problem is that people like you can't stand it when someone refuses to play by the rules of a system that's designed to destroy them. The system didn't destroy you, Harry, Whoopi said, her voice cutting through his increasingly frantic rhetoric like a blade. You're sitting here as one of the most privileged people on the planet, with more opportunities and resources than most people could dream of, and you're acting like you're some kind of victim. That's what people have a problem with. Harry was now fully standing, his chair pushed back so violently that it scraped against the studio floor with a sound that made everyone in the audience wince. His face was contorted with rage, all pretense of royal dignity completely abandoned. Privileged? You think being born into a family that sees you as nothing more than a spare part, that watches you struggle and does nothing to help, you think that's privilege? I think having access to the best education, the best healthcare, unlimited financial resources, and a global platform to share your story is the definition of privilege, Whoopi replied, still seated but now looking up at him with an expression that was part concern, part disappointment. And I think using that privilege to attack people who can't defend themselves publicly is cowardly. The word hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and Harry's reaction was immediate and explosive. Cowardly? You want to talk about cowardly? How about a family that leaks stories to the press about their own children, that throws them under the bus to protect their own image? How about a system that would rather destroy someone than admit it made mistakes? But you're doing the exact same thing, Whoopi shot back, her own voice finally showing some heat. You're using the press to attack your family. You're throwing them under the bus to protect your own image. The only difference is you're getting paid for it, and they can't respond without looking petty. How is that any different from what you're accusing them of doing? Harry's hands were clenched into fists now, his entire body radiating a barely contained fury that was making the security personnel stationed around the studio very nervous. Because I'm telling the truth. Because everything I've said can be verified, can be corroborated. I'm not making things up or spinning stories. I'm sharing what actually happened. Then why won't you provide that verification? Whoopi pressed, sensing that she had him on the defensive now. Why are all your claims based on your memory, your interpretation, your feelings? Where are the documents, the recordings, the witnesses? Who can confirm these things actually happened the way you say they did? I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else, Harry snarled, his voice now so loud that several audience members were visibly uncomfortable. My word should be enough. My experience should be enough. The fact that you're demanding some kind of evidence suggests that you've already decided I'm lying. Whoopi stood up now, her own patience finally reaching its limit. Your word isn't enough when you're making accusations that could destroy other people's reputations and relationships. Your experience isn't enough when it's being used to justify behavior that hurts innocent people. And demanding evidence isn't the same as calling you a liar. It's called responsible journalism. The confrontation had now moved beyond the confines of a typical interview into something that resembled a public breakdown. Harry was pacing back and forth in the small space between his chair and Whoopi's desk, his movements erratic and unpredictable. The studio audience was completely silent, but their discomfort was palpable. Responsible journalism. Harry's laugh was bitter and slightly unhinged. Is that what you call ambushing guests with gotcha questions and hostile interrogations? Is that what passes for responsibility in your world? Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like tabloid sensationalism dressed up as legitimate media. The only thing sensational here is your reaction to being asked basic questions about your public statements. Whoopi replied, her voice now carrying a steely edge that suggested she was done being patient. You came on this show knowing we're going to discuss your book, your interviews, your public criticisms of your family. If you weren't prepared to defend those positions, you shouldn't have agreed to be here. Harry stopped pacing abruptly, turning to face her with an expression of pure venom. I was prepared to have an honest conversation with someone I thought was a professional. What I wasn't prepared for was to be attacked by someone who's clearly been compromised by the same establishment forces that have been trying to silence me for years. The accusation was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that for a moment Whoopi was genuinely speechless. The control room was now in full panic mode, with producers frantically discussing whether to cut to commercial or let this train wreck continue to unfold live on television. Compromised, Whoopi finally managed, her voice a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. Harry, you're having a breakdown on live television because someone asked you to take responsibility for your actions. That's not a conspiracy, that's consequences. Don't you dare tell me I'm having a breakdown, Harry screamed, his voice now so loud that it was distorting through the studio's sound system. Don't you dare psychoanalyze me or suggest that my legitimate anger at being ambushed is somehow evidence of mental instability. You people are all the same, always trying to gaslight anyone who dares to challenge your narrative. Whoopi had seen enough. She turned toward the camera, her professional demeanor somehow reasserting itself despite the chaos unfolding around her. We're going to take a break, she announced to the viewing audience, but Harry wasn't finished. No, we're not taking a break, he shouted, stepping between Whoopi and the camera. We're going to finish this conversation right now. You started this interrogation, and you're going to see it through to the end. Security personnel were now moving toward the set, their presence subtle but unmistakable. Whoopi gestured for them to wait, still hoping to salvage something from this disaster. Harry, you need to calm down and sit down, or this interview is over. This interview was over the moment you decided to attack me instead of having a real conversation, Harry spat. But don't worry, the world is going to see exactly what kind of person you really are, exactly what kind of show this really is. You've just given me more material than I could have hoped for. Is that a threat? Whoopi asked, her eyebrows raised in genuine surprise at how far he was willing to take this. It's a promise, Harry replied, his voice dropping back to that dangerous whisper. People need to know how guests are really treated here, how legitimate voices are silenced and attacked by people who pretend to be objective journalists but are really just mouthpieces for the establishment. That was the final straw. Whoopi nodded to security, who immediately moved in to escort Harry from the set. As they approached, he spun around to face them, his eyes wild with a combination of rage and something that looked disturbingly like panic. Don't you dare touch me, he warned, backing away from the security guards. I'm leaving on my own, but not because you're making me. I'm leaving because this whole thing has been a sham from the beginning." As Harry was escorted from the studio, still shouting about media conspiracies and establishment cover-ups, Whoopi turned back to the camera with the weary expression of someone who had just witnessed something genuinely disturbing. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or simply try to process what they had just seen. And that's how one of the most explosive television interviews in recent memory came to an end, with the prince's meltdown exposing the very character flaws that his critics had been pointing out all along. What did you think about Harry's behavior during this confrontation? Was Whoopi's questioning fair game, or did she cross a line? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments when celebrity interviews go completely off the rails.